When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. walked onto the set of one of the most watched political talk shows in America, the audience expected just another heated debate. What they didn't know was that the host, Ethan Caldwell, had one goal: to corner, humiliate, and discredit his guest with a series of gotcha questions. But what Ethan didn't realize was that RFK Jr. wasn't just another politician, he was a force of nature. And what happened next didn't just leave the host speechless, it sent shockwaves through the media, because in true RFK Jr. fashion, he turned this interview into a masterclass on truth, power, and exposing the establishment. It was a studio buzzing with energy, the bright overhead lights bathing the stage in a golden glow as cameras panned over a restless crowd. Audience members leaned forward in their seats, some clutching their phones, already poised to record. They weren't just here for an interview, they were here for a takedown. At the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, the smooth-talking, self-assured liberal host, known for his gotcha-style interviews and viral takedowns of politicians who didn't share his worldview. He sat with perfect posture, his designer suit crisp, a polished smirk fixed on his face. He thrived on these moments, the build-up before a guest walked into his carefully laid trap. Tonight's guest? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The name alone carried weight, evoking a dynasty of American politics. But unlike the Kennedy legacy most people associated with liberal ideals, RFK Jr. was a wild card, a populist, a disruptor, a man who didn't fit into the mainstream's neatly drawn boxes. And Ethan was eager to remind him of that. A stagehand whispered something into his earpiece. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, heads turned toward the entrance. And then he walked in. RFK Jr. entered with a quiet, unshakable confidence. No nervous glances, no rushed steps. He shook hands with the show's producer, nodded at a few audience members, then finally reached Ethan. Their handshake was firm, equal parts cordial and loaded. RFK Jr. took his seat with a slight smirk, crossing one leg over the other, exuding the calm of a man who already knew how this was going to go. Ethan leaned forward, smirk widening. His voice was warm, smooth, a mask of politeness just thin enough to see through. Not every day we have a Kennedy with, let's say, controversial views in this chair. A few chuckles from the audience, a few knowing nods. The trap had been set. RFK Jr. chuckled softly, shaking his head. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, he simply folded his hands in his lap, relaxed, waiting. "Well," he said, voice steady, ready for battle. "Let's see where this goes, Ethan." And just like that, the energy in the room shifted. The audience had come expecting a takedown. Instead, they were about to witness a masterclass in composure. Ethan wasted no time. "Let's start with the elephant in the room," he said, flashing his signature grin, the kind that screamed, "I've got you right where I want you." He leaned in, pen tapping lightly against the desk, voice casual but cutting. "You've been labeled a conspiracy theorist. Do you think your views on vaccines and government overreach have any credibility?" The audience laughed, a few members shaking their heads as if RFK Jr. had already lost. RFK Jr. didn't blink. Instead, he exhaled slowly, leaned forward just slightly, and met Ethan's gaze head-on. "You mean the same government that lied about WMDs, the lab leak, and spying on its own citizens?" The audience gasped. Ethan's smirk faltered, just a flicker, but it was there. The reaction wasn't what he had expected. RFK Jr. tilted his head slightly, letting the moment breathe. His voice remained calm, measured, like a professor explaining something simple to a student who should already know better. "Tell me, Ethan, at what point does skepticism become a conspiracy? When the government lies once, twice? Or do we have to wait until we find out years later that the so-called misinformation was actually true?" The audience murmured, shifting uncomfortably. Some whispered to their neighbors. Ethan cleared his throat, regaining his footing. That's a clever way to dodge the question, but let's be real. You've questioned the safety of vaccines, and public health experts say, public health experts? RFK Jr. cut in smoothly, one eyebrow raised. You mean the ones who told people that if they got the shot, they wouldn't get infected? The ones who ignored natural immunity, then quietly admitted later that they were wrong? Those experts. A low oof rippled through the crowd. Ethan's jaw clenched just slightly. RFK Jr. sat back, still relaxed. He wasn't arguing. He was dismantling. If questioning official narratives is dangerous, he continued, his voice softer now, letting the words sink in, maybe the real problem isn't the questions, it's the answers. Dead silence. For the first time that night, Ethan didn't have a comeback ready to fire. Ethan blinked, shifting in his seat. The moment of silence hung thick between them, the weight of RFK Jr.'s last statement still settling over the room. But Ethan was a pro, and pros don't let silence linger too long. He forced a chuckle, flipping through his cue cards as if searching for the perfect counterattack. Then, with an air of forced confidence, he straightened his tie and leaned forward. But respected scientists disagree with you. A calculated move. The audience perked up. This was the classic appeal to authority, the moment where RFK Jr. was supposed to buckle, backpedal, or fumble. Instead, RFK Jr. grinned. Not a nervous grin, not an unsure grin, a knowing one. The kind that said, "Oh, we're really doing this." "Which ones?" he asked, tilting his head. "The ones funded by Pfizer or Moderna?" Boom, the audience murmured, a few people chuckling, others clapping, some even outright cheering. The energy in the room shifted again, the carefully controlled media theater suddenly feeling very real. Ethan's smirk twitched. He knew he had to keep control. "Come on," he said, forcing another chuckle. "Are you saying every scientist who disagrees with you is bought off?" RFK Jr. leaned back, crossed his legs, and folded his hands in his lap. "Not every scientist, Ethan," he said smoothly. "Just the ones you put on TV." Scattered applause. Ethan exhaled through his nose, gripping his pen a little tighter. RFK Jr. kept going, his voice calm but unmistakably sharp. "Here's the problem. The agencies that are supposed to regulate big pharma, like the FDA, the CDC, aren't actually independent. They're funded by the very companies they're supposed to keep in check. You think that's a conspiracy? No, that's public record. You can look it up." The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were listening. The FDA gets nearly half of its budget from the pharmaceutical industry. The CDC buys and sells billions in vaccines through the government's own contracts. So tell me, Ethan, when these respected scientists show up on your network, are they speaking for science, or are they speaking for the people who pay them? Ethan swallowed, his usual quick-fire retorts failing him. The audience wasn't just reacting anymore, they were questioning. And that was far more dangerous than any single soundbite. Ethan inhaled deeply, regaining some of his composure. He wasn't about to lose control of his own show. His fingers drummed against the table as he forced another smirk, trying to play off the moment. "It sounds like you're playing the victim here," he said, his voice edged with sarcasm. "Are you suggesting the media is unfair to you?" A classic pivot, a desperate one. The audience could feel it. RFK Jr. laughed, not bitterly, not nervously, but genuinely. He shook his head, glancing around the room as if Ethan had just told a joke. "You mean the same media that pushed Russiagate for years with zero evidence?" The audience stirred, whispers spreading like wildfire. RFK Jr. continued, his voice growing steadier, sharper, cutting through the noise like a blade. "The same media that censored the Hunter Biden laptop story, called it Russian disinformation, then admitted 2 years later that it was real." Ethan tensed, his lips parted slightly as if to interrupt, but RFK Jr. wasn't done. "The same media that told people to stay inside, close their businesses, fire workers over mandates while they attended galas, flew private jets to climate conferences, and partied maskless at Hollywood award shows. The audience erupted, laughter, applause, even a few people standing. Ethan shifted in his chair, his usual control slipping away. "Robert," he started. RFK Jr. held up a hand, just slightly. Not aggressive, just enough to cut through the noise. "Look, Ethan, the media isn't here to tell the truth. It's here to protect power. When it suits them, they pretend to be watchdogs. But when it threatens their narrative, they turn into lapdogs." Another eruption from the audience. Louder this time. Ethan sat rigid, clearly trying to maintain his composure. But his audience, his own audience, wasn't with him anymore. And the worst part? RFK Jr. wasn't even trying to win. He was just telling the truth. And that was far more dangerous than anything Ethan had prepared for. Ethan adjusted his posture, rolling his shoulders back like a boxer, shaking off a hit. He wasn't out yet. He still had cards to play. He glanced at his cue cards, then back at RFK Jr. A new angle forming in his mind. Climate change. That was the one topic where he was sure he could paint his guest as outdated, anti-science, even reckless. He leaned in, flashing his signature smirk. "You've questioned certain climate policies. Are you saying climate change isn't real?" A layup. The audience perked up, some grinning, waiting for RFK Jr. to stumble into the trap. But he didn't. Instead, RFK Jr. cut in smoothly, voice calm, deliberate. "Ethan, don't misrepresent me." Ethan's smile flickered. "Of course, the climate is changing," RFK Jr. continued, his tone steady, unwavering. "The question is, do you actually care about solutions or just control?" Boom. The audience erupted. Scattered claps turned into full-blown applause. Even some of Ethan's most loyal viewers nodded in approval. Ethan's smirk vanished. His jaw tightened, his grip on the cue cards visibly stiff. This wasn't the answer he had prepped for. RFK Jr. leaned forward, his hands folded on the table, the picture of composure. "See, this is the problem," he said. "Real environmentalism is about cleaning up our water, our air, making sure our food isn't poisoned with chemicals. But the people in charge, they don't care about that. They care about power." The audience was hanging on every word now. "Tell me, Ethan, how come small farmers in Middle America are getting taxed into oblivion over carbon footprints while the biggest polluters in the world, China, multinational corporations, the billionaire class, get sweetheart deals and loopholes?" Silence. Why are everyday Americans being told to pay more for gas, for groceries, for energy, while politicians fly private jets to climate summits and pat themselves on the back? A low murmur swept through the room. This was hitting home. Ethan forced a chuckle, but it was tight, almost strained. He was losing control again. "So what? You don't believe in reducing emissions?" he pressed, trying to salvage the moment. RFK Jr. shook his head. "I believe in real solutions, not punishing working people while elites cash in." The audience roared. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing. The trap had failed. And for the first time all night, he looked like he knew it. Ethan was struggling, and everyone could see it. His usual rhythm, the carefully rehearsed pivots, the well-timed interruptions, was completely off balance. But he wasn't about to fold. He took a slow breath, tapping his pen against the desk, searching for an opening. Then he found it. "Robert," he said, his voice taking on a measured, almost concerned tone. "Let's talk about something serious. You've been accused of spreading vaccine misinformation. Aren't you putting lives at risk?" The audience murmured in agreement. This was supposed to be a winning move. But RFK Jr. didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head, almost amused. "Misinformation?" he repeated, as if the word itself was a joke. Then he dropped the hammer. "If it's misinformation, why did the CDC quietly change its guidelines last year?" Gasps. Ethan blinked. RFK Jr. pressed forward, unshaken. Why did Pfizer redact key trial data? Why did public health officials push mandates based on claims they later admitted weren't true? Silence. Ethan looked stunned, caught between responding and staying silent. The audience felt it, the shift in energy, the reality that RFK Jr. was in full control now. And then he delivered the knockout. "I'm not against vaccines, Ethan. I'm against corruption." Ethan's face fell. "But if calling out corruption is a problem," RFK Jr. added, his voice smooth, "maybe that tells us everything we need to know." The crowd erupted. Some stood, others clapped. A few even whistled. Ethan? He just sat there, hands folded, staring at his guest. For the first time all night, he had nothing left to say. Ethan was losing control, and he knew it. The audience wasn't nodding along with him anymore. They weren't smirking at RFK Jr. like they had been at the start. They were listening, really listening. And that was a problem. He couldn't let this spiral any further. He needed to remind the audience that RFK Jr. was just another outsider with no real path to victory. A novelty act, not a real political force. So he went for it. "You're running for office, but your views don't align with either major party," Ethan said, his tone sharper now, almost accusatory. "Do you really think you stand a chance?" "A smug attempt at dismissal," the audience murmured, waiting for RFK Jr. to justify himself. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he smirked. "That's exactly why I have a chance, Ethan." The words hung in the air, and for a second, it was dead silent. Then, the room exploded. Applause, cheers. Some even stood up, clapping as if RFK Jr. had just landed a knockout punch. Because in a way, he had. Ethan visibly tensed. RFK Jr. wasn't finished. "Americans are tired of being lied to by both sides," he continued, his voice calm but unshakably firm. "They're sick of the politicians who make promises they never keep, the media that picks winners and losers, the insiders who run Washington like a private club." The crowd roared again. Ethan forced a chuckle, but his grip on the desk tightened. RFK Jr. leaned in slightly, locking eyes with the host, his tone cutting but composed. "I'm not here to fit into your labels, Ethan. I'm here to tell the truth. And judging by this reaction..." He gestured subtly toward the audience, who were still clapping, some even whistling. "People are ready for that." Another wave of cheers. Ethan's face was stone cold. He knew it. The producers knew it. The audience knew it. He had completely lost control of his own show. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This was supposed to be his moment, his viral takedown. Instead, RFK Jr. was winning. He needed a reset, a lifeline, something, anything, to bring the narrative back in his favor. He went for one last desperate swing. "If your views are so popular," Ethan said, leaning forward, his tone harder now, "why does the mainstream dismiss you?" A classic trap. Frame him as fringe, paint him as a conspiracy theorist without ever saying the words. The kind of question designed to force a defensive response. RFK Jr.? He didn't even blink. He leaned back, folding his arms slowly, like a man who knew exactly what was coming. Then, in the calmest, most matter-of-fact voice imaginable, he dropped the hammer. "You just answered your own question." The audience froze. Even Ethan looked confused for a half-second before RFK Jr. continued. "The mainstream exists to protect the establishment, not the people." Boom. Silence. Then, a tidal wave of applause. This time, it wasn't just polite claps, it was a standing ovation. The audience had officially turned. Ethan sat there, frozen, gripping his pen, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. He had no comeback, no snarky pivot, no rehearsed counterattack. Because RFK Jr. had just exposed the entire game, and the worst part, the people knew it. For the first time in his career, Ethan Caldwell realized he had lost the room. The second the show cut to commercial, the studio was still buzzing, audience members murmuring, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others hurriedly typing on their phones. Ethan sat stiffly in his chair, staring at the desk, his usual confidence completely drained. The producers backstage were scrambling. "We need to control the narrative now. Clip out some of his answers before we upload it to YouTube." Do we spin it, or just hope people forget? It didn't matter, because they were already too late. Somewhere in the audience, a live streamer had captured everything. A perfect, uninterrupted angle of RFK Jr., owning the moment, exposing the media, and turning the crowd against their own host. And within minutes, the internet was on fire. The clips spread like wildfire, from Twitter to YouTube, from Facebook to Instagram. Reaction videos flooded TikTok. Even conservative, independent, and neutral commentators were weighing in. This is what happens when you put a real leader in front of a scripted talking head. RFK Jr. just ended this man's career in real time. You can't fake authenticity. That's why this hit so hard. Ethan's own fan base was split. Some loyalists tried to defend him, but they were outnumbered by people who saw through the act. Even mainstream pundits started damage control. CNN analyst, RFK Jr.'s populist rhetoric is dangerous and misleading. MSNBC, this was a case of misinformation wrapped in charisma. Ethan Caldwell, issuing a statement on Twitter, "Healthy debate is important. I respect RFK Jr.'s passion, even if I disagree with his views. Let's keep the conversation civil." It was weak, forced, too little, too late, because no one was talking about Ethan anymore. They were talking about RFK Jr., and nothing could stop it now. RFK Jr. didn't gloat. There were no victory laps, no smug tweets, no self-congratulatory press statements. He simply moved on. But the world hadn't. A week later, in a small, no-frills press conference, a reporter finally asked him, "Mr. Kennedy, did you expect your interview with Ethan Caldwell to go this viral?" RFK Jr. chuckled, shaking his head. "I just told the truth," he said simply. "It's amazing how rare that is these days." That one line? Instantly viral, again. Because by now something bigger was happening. People who had never considered RFK Jr. before were watching his speeches, reading his policies, questioning everything. The comment sections on his videos exploding. "I wasn't a fan before, but after that interview, I'm listening. I never realized how corrupt the media really was." He's actually making sense. That's what scares them. Across America, the awakening had begun. This wasn't just a viral moment anymore. This was a cultural shift. More people started rejecting scripted narratives, questioning talking points, and seeking the truth for themselves. And RFK Jr.'s campaign numbers? They skyrocketed. Ethan's reputation, a cautionary tale, and the media, they knew what had just happened. But there was nothing they could do to stop it, because in a world full of scripted lies, the truth is the most powerful weapon of all, and RFK Jr. just proved it. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even more insane.